Yeah, but you know I didn't get it.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us this evening as Barnes & Noble welcomes Barbara Kessel in celebration of her new book, Suddenly Jewish. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's story is very familiar to us. She learned as an adult that she had a Jewish heritage, as did the 160 people on which Barbara's book is based. Here are dramatic and poignant first-person stories filled with heartbreak and joy, narrated by Jews raised as Gentiles who discovered their Jewish roots long after most of us know who we are. Here to tell us what it's like, the confusion, and then the resolve, in her words and in their words, is Barbara Kessel and Suddenly Jewish.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And I always start my talks by saying, I thank God for the experience of this book because it has been a kick from beginning until now. The beginning was, in fact, Madeleine Albright. In February '97, she was profiled in the Washington Post when she was named Secretary of State, and Michael Dobbs, who wrote the article, mentioned almost in passing that her parents were Czechoslovakian refugees from the Nazis and Jewish, and that two of her grandparents had been killed in the Auschwitz death camps. And as you will recall, her reaction was, oh my goodness, this is a great surprise. And I had a really hard time with that, and I know a lot of people did. There were a lot of articles about it saying, how could she not have known she was Jewish? There was talk about a cousin who had lived in the house who was Jewish, who knew she was. People speculated, how could she not have asked, Joey and Susie have grandparents, why don't I have grandparents? Where are my grandparents? So it was a little bit hard to swallow. On the other hand, we can't pass judgment because her parents went through a horrific experience, and who knows how, I don't know how I would have reacted. In addition to which, it's very hard to have your parents look you in the eye and say, we are not Jewish, and call them liars. It takes a lot of psychological energy to call your parents anything. It's distancing, and if you want to have a good relationship, it does not happen. And so there was a lot of conversation back and forth, pros and cons about that, in living rooms and on TV and in magazines. And then it died down, as everything does. But for me, it never died down. There was a constant dialogue in my head. What is it like to find out you're not who you thought you were? On some level, I approached it as simplistically as, what does it feel like to be black-haired all your life, and then one time you're an adult and you walk past a mirror and you find out that, no, you've been blonde all your life. And so my book is essentially, is it true blondes have more fun? I wanted to know, what did it feel like to find out you're not who you thought you were, you're not who your parents said you were, and your parents aren't who they said they were. So I placed one of those little author's queries in the Sunday book review section of the New York Times, and all it said was, for a book on identity, I would like to interview people who discover they are of Jewish descent. And from that, I got 46 letters. The Times makes you put your address in, which made me a little bit nervous. I'm a New Yorker, and I'm as paranoid as the next one, but they wouldn't accept the query without my address. And the truth is, I did not get too many crank letters. But I didn't get as many responses as I wanted, and there was some uniformity to the responses in the sense that people who wrote to me were willing to admit that, yes, they were Jewish. And some of them embraced it to greater and lesser extents. I wanted to hear from the people who were horrified. I wanted to hear from the people who were appalled. And what I did, in addition to that query in the Times, was I put my query out on the internet. And the internet is a phenomenal research tool. I used it so much in the making of this book. First, I put my query out on websites that would make sense for research like this. I put it out on adoption web pages. I put it on religion web pages. But again, I was hearing from people who were willing to talk about it. So then what I did was, anytime I went on a guest book on a website, cooking, if I bought an undershirt, I would sign my name, Barbara Kessel, who was writing a book about people who found out they're Jewish. And that way I widened my net. And the other way I found people was word of mouth. I would, for example, interview someone who was willing to talk about it, and I would say, do you have siblings? And how did they find out they were Jewish, and how did they feel about it? And someone would say, oh, my brother doesn't want to talk about it. It's a forbidden subject. We don't go down that road. And I'd say, well, could I talk to him? And that's how I got more of a diversity of reaction. I did get off to a bit of a rocky start. My very first postcard, actually it was a letter, was from a fellow who wrote and said, I'm an African American and I'm incarcerated in some upstate federal prison. I have 11 years to go on my sentence and I have pretty much nothing to do, so I'm researching my roots. And I know I was adopted, and here's a letter from, and he sent me a Xerox copy. Here is a letter from the Louise Wise Adoption Agency, and the letter said, yes, your mother was a Jewish young lady, and she gave birth to you in year so-and-so. And he wrote, every Sunday, a Lubavitch rabbi comes up to the prison and teaches me about Judaism because I'm in the process of embracing my roots. And I thought, whoa, this is going to make a great interview. But first I called my neighbor, who was assistant commissioner of the New Jersey prison system, and I read him the letter. And he said, which prison is it? And I told him, and he said, you know, if this fellow has 11 years to go in that prison, you don't want to go near him. You don't want to tell him your name. You don't want to tell him your address. Put it in the crank file. And so that was a dead end. Then I got a card from a fellow who said, I was conceived in the early 50s from a sperm bank. And since most donors to sperm banks are medical school students, and since most medical school students are Jewish, I think I must be Jewish. Well, that wasn't quite compelling enough for me to interview him and pursue it, but the truth of the matter is I giggled, much like many of you did, but then after the giggles died down, I said to myself, this is really very poignant. Here is a person who is really desperate to know his roots. The book is interspersed with interviews not just with people who found out they're Jewish, but also with professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, biologists. And I mentioned this to Dr. Evan Imber-Black of the Ackerman Institute here in New York, and she specializes in family secrets. And she said, yes, people who are conceived from sperm banks do have a driving need to know who they are, and they will never know because those records are not kept. So even if they tried to look for them, they couldn't find them because there are no records of who the donors were. Another letter I got that I put into my crank file, and I have to tell you, at the end of the research, there were no letters in my crank file, was a woman from Wayne, New Jersey. And she wrote, my children went to school with Meryl Streep, and she wrote, you probably know that when Meryl Streep was in high school, she found out she was Jewish. Now, I know what Meryl Streep looks like, and I never said to myself, Meryl Streep is surely Jewish. So I put it away. I just couldn't believe it. And I also tried to research it, and I couldn't find anything. And then one night, 1 o'clock in the morning, I was flipping with the remote, the way a man does, you know, from one channel to another. And there was the Actors Studio, which is a terrific biography program. I just love it. It's very serious, but it's celebrities. And there was Meryl Streep, and this was in the middle of the show, and she was saying, and that's how I found out I was Jewish. But now let's talk about my new movie. So I missed it. But I took the letter out of the crank file, and I put it in the regular file. Another fellow I heard from was Joe Zavala from Texas. Joe Zavala wrote to me that he said, he's a radio technician in the Navy. He said, I'm very active in my church, always have been. And he said, one day I was walking down the street at night and God spoke to me. And he said, God told me that I'm Jewish. He said, so I rang up my pastor right away, and I said, what do I do? I've always been active in my church, and now I find out I'm Jewish. And the pastor said, you know, it's funny you should say that, because Zavala, your last name, is in fact a typically Hispanic Jewish name, and it's from the Hebrew contraction Zahavka, gold of God. And your name is probably from the crypto-Jews who left the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. So this Joe Zavala tells me that he went home and he says, Dad, I just found out we're Jewish and our name means gold of God. And his father said, yes, so where's our money? But he was a very serious fellow. And the truth of the matter is, even if somebody told me that God spoke to them through their fillings, everyone was so genuine that I took them very seriously. And Joe told me that he had another chat with his pastor, and he said God came to him again and said, just be yourself. And just with those two words, he was able to calm down, and he said to his pastor, God has told me to be myself. What does that mean? And the pastor said, well, you're in a wonderful position now. You have found the true religion, Christianity, but you have contact with Jewish people because you are Jewish. You can now go out among the Jewish people and bring them back to the true religion. And he ended his letter to me, be well and be blessed, and I wished him the same thing. Those were beautiful letters he wrote to me. But I wasn't getting very far with this book. There was another fellow who wrote, I used to be a Benedictine monk, and now I'm married, and I have 6 kids, and I'm Jewish. Sincerely yours, da da da. So I wrote to him, and I said, yeah, you know, this is very interesting. What I really wanted to know was how a Benedictine monk met a woman and got married and had 6 kids, but he wasn't willing to go down that road. So we discussed how he became Jewish, and he told me that, first he said, I really would like to discuss this with you, but I'm writing my own book, lots of luck. But I couldn't let it go. I really wanted to know his story. And so he told me that he was teaching church history and church theology, and that the New Testament never rang true for him. It just didn't resonate. Whereas what he was calling the Old Testament then really spoke to him. And the more he researched it, the more he realized he couldn't accept the New Testament anymore, and he left what he was doing, and he converted to Judaism. And after he converted and found out more about what Judaism is about, he looked back at some of the traditions that he grew up with his grandparents, some of the foods, some of the cultural markers, and he realized that they were Jewish, and he had not had to convert. And what was amazing to me in the course of this research, over a year and a half, I had 225 responses, 60 of which are in the book. Easily 10% of those people converted to Judaism way before they found out they were Jewish. And I just thought that was fascinating. And many more of them said to me that that they used to be drawn, before they found out, they would be drawn to Jewish people. They liked Jewish theology. They weren't comfortable with who they were. They liked Jewish food, Jewish music. It started sounding a bit like there was something called a Jewish soul, but that I saved for my research. I heard from priests, I heard from a nun, I heard from Arabs, I heard from Jews for Jesus, I even heard from a neo-Nazi who found out he was Jewish. Some of the letters were poignant, very much like that sperm bank fellow, and some of them were just funny. One woman in the Midwest told me that she found out she was Jewish, and she was very excited, and she told her neighbor, who was a good friend, I'm Jewish. She said the woman stared at her and kind of waited to see if bagels would fly out of her ears. I asked some standard questions, and I was trying very hard not to give the kind of question that would have a yes-no answer. I really wanted to elicit a conversation and loosen people up and have them talk with me, and eventually they did. The questions I ended up with were, where are your parents from? What are their last names? What was your mother's maiden name? How did you find out you were Jewish? how old were you when you found out? How long ago was it that you found out? Once you found out, was the family willing to talk about it? How did your siblings react? Do you have cousins? Because what I discovered, which I thought was very heartbreaking, was that many times if the parents wanted to absolutely hide that they were Jewish, they would cut off from the rest of the family so that there could be no leakage. So I thought that was tragic, actually. They actually lost family that way. How has it changed your views of Jews, of Judaism, and of yourself? And over the course of these 225 interviews, I found that categories emerged, much like when you take a Polaroid picture and it starts off completely blank, white, and then distinctions arise. I found that happened very naturally with these interviews. The book has 4 categories in it, but really there were 5. The 5th one simply wasn't dramatic enough. But the 5th one was the largest one, and that was the category of people who were descended from immigrants to this country at the turn of the century, 1880 to 1920, when there was a very large immigration from Eastern Europe. These were people who left sometimes because of anti-Semitism, many times because of economic deprivation. And they came here for a better life. But there's an old story. They would come in to a job interview in a shop, in a factory, and the boss would say to them, listen, if you're not going to come in on Saturday, don't bother coming in on Monday. And so it wasn't convenient to be Jewish. You just couldn't get a job. So they lost their traditions over time. And eventually, by the 3rd generation, the grandchildren, many of them just not forgot. There was nothing to forget. They had no clue they were Jewish because there were no Jewish traditions. So that was my largest category, but that's not quite as dramatic as the others. And each category, I discovered, has its own issue. I arranged them chronologically from furthest away to now, and the oldest category is the one that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the crypto-Jews. They used to be called Marranos, but that's not politically correct because the word Marrano means pig, and it's not a word anyone wants to be called, anyone should be called. And so crypto-Jew, secret Jew, is the word that's used for these descendants of people who left the Iberian Peninsula in 1492 when they were given some very unpalatable choices to either convert to Catholicism or be killed or leave. These were people who were happy where they were and were happy being Jewish. And so they created a new alternative for themselves, and they decided they're going to be secret Jews. So they pretended to be Catholic. But the church was very aggressive in finding them out. And so when I interviewed their descendants in the southwest of the United States, and they're all over the world, but I happened to go to a convention of theirs in Denver, I talked with people who came from families where the grandmother would go down into the basement on Friday night and light candles. And when the granddaughter would say, "Why are you doing this?" the grandmother would say, "It's secret, I can't tell you, it's something we do in our family." And eventually, for some of them, there were enough of these strange customs that when they did come into contact with Jewish literature or with Jewish people, they found out that these were Sabbath candles, and there were any number of customs, eating meat that doesn't have any blood in it, eating a flatbread on Passover or Easter for them. They discovered that they were Jewish. And for many of them, it's very difficult because they live in Catholic communities, and this is a shock. And it's not a popular thing to find out. And so they're wrestling with discovering that they're Jewish, and not all of them are embracing it. It's dangerous still. Their issue is one of transmission, because how do we know they're authentic? If the grandmother can't tell the granddaughter why we're doing this, and all they know is that they should only marry their cousins, they should not marry anybody from outside the family, but they're not told why, we can't really know how authentic they are. But that was not my focus. That's a scholarly, academic issue. I was only interested in what does it feel like to find out you're Jewish. Another category that made itself clear was people who were adopted, because they would do a root search and they would find Jewish parentage. And that's where I interviewed a Palestinian woman who found out she had a Jewish father. I interviewed a Jewish woman who found out she had a Palestinian father. There were a lot of shocks for these people. And, of course, adoptees struggle with identity issues anyway. They struggle with, okay, you're telling me my parents gave me up because it was for my own good, but really, who was my mother and did she really love me? And now they're finding out I belong to a people with a very complicated history, so they're dealing with all sorts of identity issues, which are very resolvable, but at the initial impact is traumatic and is shocking. The most heartrending category for me that I found was hidden children. These are people who, as infants and toddlers, were given by their Jewish parents to monasteries and convents or non-Jewish families to save them from the Nazis. And they were pre-verbal, they were tiny little things. So they were, even though they were pre-verbal, they were wrenched away from their parents, and it was dreadful. And some of them were adopted by very loving homes. Some of them were adopted by people who used them as slave labor. And some of them were simply abused, but taken in for money. Those were the stories that made me cry, because of that double, some of them were just abandoned. And there's a whole group in Poland now that are discovering they're Jewish. The way people find out that they're Jewish includes this group, where there could be a foster parent who's on a deathbed and has a conscience pang and says, before I expire, I just want you to know that actually you're not my child, and you're not Jewish, and your parents gave you to me when you were an infant to save you from the Nazis, and they died in the camps, or they disappeared and I don't know where they are. That is one way people found out. Another way is one woman told me she went to the funeral of a family friend. She was, as far as she knew, she was not Jewish. The funeral was a Jewish funeral, and the congregations, the assemblage started reciting the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer in Hebrew, and she found herself saying the mourner's prayer in Aramaic, actually, along with the Jewish family, and she didn't know how she knew it. She just knew it. And she wasn't the only one who told me such a story. And then she went and asked her parents, what's going on here? How come I knew this prayer? And they admitted that they were Jewish. And when I asked a psychologist how this could be, he said there's something called a reservoir of memory, that probably when she was very young, she overheard, she absorbed, she retained, there were comments, and so on some level she did know she was Jewish, and this is how it came out. Children of survivors, the issue for hidden children is the trauma of separation. That makes sense. There's attachment disorder. Some of them have a hard time establishing relationships later in life. Children of survivors have a bit of a different issue. This is where somebody came through the Holocaust and said, I do not want my children to suffer what I went through. And so they don't tell them they're Jewish. And the children end up parenting the parents, because the parents lost their children very young, had no model for parenting. And so the children, sensing that there's something painful in the background, and this could be Madeleine Albright, I don't know, don't pursue it. There are questions, there are open-ended issues in the family, but the kids intuit, and this is probably my story because my mother left Hamburg, Germany after Kristallnacht, and I always knew I was Jewish. But there's no talking to her about it because it's clear to me that it's too painful. And so I know very little about my grandparents and about my mother's childhood. One of my favorite stories is the Landman sisters. These are three women now, whom I interviewed successively and close enough in succession that they didn't have time to compare notes. They didn't have time to talk to each other and find out what I asked and what did you tell her and what did you tell her. So the three of them told me this story independently, and they said that they went to Vermont to visit these girls were of German extraction. The parents were German. They were Jewish, but they didn't tell the girls. They kept in touch with a German Jewish family who had no trouble declaring who they were and living a Jewish life. So every year they would get together, and this one year the non-Jewish German family went up to Vermont to visit the Jewish family, and it was April. So the hosts said, you know, this is our Passover, and we're having a Seder tonight, and you might find it very interesting to participate or witness our Seder. It'll be like watching the Discovery Channel. It'll just be something interesting for you. They said, sure, we came to spend time with you. Whatever we do is fine. So they go there for dinner, and the Seder starts, and the host hands out the Haggadah, the script for the Seder. And it starts off in Aramaic with, this is the bread of our fathers who were in Egypt, halach ma'anya diachalu avhasana ba'ara de Mitzrayim. And their father is saying this stuff. And the three girls look at each other and they say, look how smart Daddy is. All he has to do is see a foreign language and he speaks it. And it didn't occur to them for years that people don't talk in tongues that naturally, that this was something very odd. And they each told me that story independently. And the way they found out they were Jewish is that they were on a family trip to Berlin. And they were walking through the streets of Berlin, and the father got all excited, and he said, oh, this is where I used to live. And they said, oh, interesting, nice building. Then they turn a corner, and he says, and this is where I lived. And they said, oh, really? And then they go another 2 blocks, and he says, and this is where I lived. And they say, Dad, nobody lives in so many places in such a short period of time. What was going on with you? Were you, like, running away or something? Yeah, I was running away. So what were you, like, running during the war? Was this like running from the Nazis or something? Yeah, I was running from the Nazis. So what were you, like, Jewish? So are we Jewish? And he said, yeah, sort of, kind of. Yeah, we're Jewish, whatever. And that was how they found out. Now, today, of these 3 women, one is president of her synagogue sisterhood, one is an atheist, and one is a Protestant. So they went in different directions. There are many different reactions among the people that I interviewed, and I said to you I wanted to find people who were horrified, and I didn't find too many, but there were some. There were people who were devout Catholics who said, oh no, I'm going to hell, this is terrible. There was one woman who said to me, this is fabulous. I lost heaven, hell, and Christmas just like that. But the reaction depended largely upon 2 factors. One was how they defined Judaism or Jewishness. If it's cultural, and if being Jewish means bagels and knishes and speaking Yiddish, then if you don't like bagels, you're not Jewish, and it's accepted or rejected, it's no big deal. If Judaism is a religion, and you believe firmly in the Trinity, and you cannot accept a monotheistic system, and you can't accept Jewish dogma, it's a religion, it's not your religion, you are therefore not Jewish. But if Judaism is conferred through the genes, if you have Jewish parents, and therefore you are Jewish, or one Jewish parent, and to me, it didn't matter if it was patrilineal, matrilineal. I was not interested in the political issues of who is a Jew. I just wanted to know, what does it feel like to find out you're part Jewish or all Jewish? Then you have a problem. Then you have an issue, because now if one or both of your parents or grandparents or whomever is Jewish, now you have something. If you're a serious person, you have something to think about. And what I found was that people are serious, and people do take their identity seriously. The other factor involved in how they react was what kind of sense of self they had. For people who were very sure of themselves and knew who they were, this was another piece of information. It's like finding out, oh, my grandfather was an Eskimo. Well, that's interesting, but this is who I am today. But for people who were searching, for people who were unsure of themselves, this was a shock. And very often it was a welcome shock, because now in this vast, scary, vulnerable universe we inhabit, now they were part of a stream. They were part of a people. They were part of a history. They even had another country that factored into their heritage. And it was very comfortable. It felt like a baby in a swaddling blanket. Now I know my fixed position, and I have cousins. I have hundreds of thousands of cousins all over the world. And so for them, it was a little bit more welcome. Regrettably, there were people, and there was one woman who told me that her son is in Lutheran divinity school, and when she found out she was Jewish and told him, he stopped talking to her. And he was livid, and to this day he doesn't talk to her. So that of course, was heartbreaking. But for the most part, people were either blasé or embraced it. Some people became observant Jews. My favorite story became the prologue of the book, and that's the fellow who found out on the day, not just the day he was going to become a priest, but the minute he was going to become a priest. He was about to accept his robe and his crucifix from the cardinal, and he blurted out, "My name is Jacques Nakash, and I have to know if I'm Jewish," because someone had made a remark to him about, "Oh, you sound just like a Jew," and he couldn't get it out of his head. And the cardinal, and this was in Paris after the war, just after the war, and the cardinal said to him, "Well, as a matter of fact, I know your mother, and I saved her from the concentration camps, and yes, you are Jewish." And today he's an Orthodox Jew living on a kibbutz in Israel. Now the story is much longer than that, but that is one of my favorites. And my other favorite, and with this I'll end, is the fellow who was born in the 60s. His mother was a hippie, and she spent 2 consecutive evenings with 2 different men. And when she was pregnant, she didn't know which one was the father, the Jewish one or the non-Jewish one. And I don't know if she flipped a coin, or she told her son that the non-Jewish fellow was the father. And so this youngster spent every summer with the non-Jewish fellow until he became 16 years old. And then his beard started to come in, and his shoulders broadened, and his hair got darker, and it started to curl up, and his nose grew, and his cheekbones changed, and all of a sudden he looked exactly like the Jewish fellow. Well, clearly something was going on here, and they went for genetic testing. And the genetic testing showed that the non-Jewish fellow had a 0% chance of being his father, and the Jewish fellow had a 97% chance of being his father. Now that part of the story is in the book. My publisher, Brandeis, in their infinite wisdom, and I mean that sincerely, cut the book down from 95,000 words to 45,000. They cut it in half, and they left only the most dramatic stories. And I heard from this fellow. When the book came out, he bought the book. I made him pay for it. And he wrote to me, and he said, "You know, I remember I gave you permission to include my story, and it's really fine." He said, "I'm just disappointed that you cut my story in half. That what you have in there is kind of the sensational part, but you didn't leave in my feelings." And I went back and I found his interview among my papers. And he was right. His reaction was very interesting, but the reason it was deleted is because it covered the reactions of so many other people who were in the book already, that it simply would have been gratuitous. But what he said was, "This revelation has had a tremendous psychic impact on me, as well as on all the families involved, for a variety of reasons. My feelings on discovering my Jewish identity are inextricably entwined with the contemplation of the meaning of parenthood, etc. I had never identified with the hodgepodge of European ancestry that I was told was mine, but my Jewishness stimulated much contemplation. I now feel strongly that I have a history and a people. It is also interesting to contemplate to what extent one can ever become part of a tradition that one discovers at an advanced age, as well as the very meaning of being a part of something. And who decides that? Is it me? It was tough. It caused a lot of bad feelings. There's a lot of animosity toward my mother. Things were awkward between me and Jake for several years. He's even loopier than I am, and I'm no linear thinker. But we're managing. I've tried to learn as much about his Jewish relatives as I can. I was an atheist as a teen, but in my early 20s I thought a lot about religion and ended up changing. Not that I'm interested in organized religion. I've been passively curious. I'm educating myself slowly, not aggressively immersing myself. I would like to identify with a group in addition to wanting to know my father and his background. And basically this was the refrain that I heard from everyone, a burning desire for identity, a desire to know who they were. And I think what I learned is you can change who you are, but you have to start from a place of honesty. You have to have your foundation, and from there you can jump off and become something else. And my thanks go to all the people who shared their stories with me. It was a very intimate experience, and I fell in love with all of them, and I hope if you read the book that you will too. Thank you very much. I will happily take questions if there are any.
I'm interested in the person that is like brought up German. I know that pork is like a very big thing in German food, and being that they were like Jewish a long time ago, did they refrain from cooking like real Christian like pork? Do you know that?
Funny. The question is, pork is anathema in Jewish tradition. It symbolizes everything that's not kosher. And so did these people have a problem with pork and with non-Jewish cooking? Some of the people found out they were Jewish because their grandmothers said that pork gave them a terrible stomach ache, and shrimp gave them a terrible stomach ache. And on Christmas Eve, they couldn't go to church because they had a terrible stomach ache. And this happened year after year, and eventually the grandchildren figured out something. It's not the pork, and it's not the stomach, and it's the church. Something's not right here. So in some cases, but in some cases they were absolutely adamant about leaving behind their Jewishness, particularly those grandchildren of immigrants. And those were the ones mostly who did not circumcise their sons, because that was a question I made myself ask. If it was a man I was interviewing, I would say, "Are you circumcised?" Because to me that was the last bastion of leaving behind your Jewishness. And it was those grandchildren, it was those ones who forgot that they were Jewish, who really wanted to get away from it, who did not circumcise their sons. Yes.
What happened to the neo-Nazi that you gave an example?
That was very interesting. The neo-Nazi was someone who was having psychological problems, and instead of going to any psychologist or any psychiatrist or a clinic, he sought out the Holocaust Center in England. Something just drew him there. And he didn't know why. And eventually the psychiatrist there did some recovered identity work with him, uncovering memories. And it emerged that he had a Jewish background. He had Jewish parents. And he had issues from that because there were toxic family secrets. Not just that. There were other issues. But he was drawn to go to a Jewish place. In the last 2 weeks, I have heard from people who had sensory memories. I found 2 people who discovered they're Jewish. For example, this one Polish lady was a cook in a Jewish home, and she was asked to make cholent, which is a traditional Jewish Sabbath food, and they gave her the recipe, and she started cooking it. She put the ingredients together in the pot, and she let it cook and cook and cook, and she started crying. And the owner of the home said, her employer said, "Why are you crying?" She said, "I don't know." And they said, "Well, did something happen? Did you fall? Did you hurt yourself? Did somebody say something to you?" She said, "It's that smell. It's that thing that you're having me cook." She said, it's just making me cry. They said, "Are you allergic?" She said, "No, I'm not allergic. I'm so sad." And they did some investigating, and it turned out that she was a Jewish child who had been placed with a non-Jewish family in Poland. And the smell brought her back. And I heard that story about 2 different people just in the last 2 weeks. So there is something that's underneath, and I wouldn't call it a Jewish soul yet. I mean, the geneticists I talked to laughed at me. They just outright laughed. Even though one geneticist I spoke to said, well, it's funny you should ask because I just found out I'm Jewish. Because everybody's Jewish to some degree. But essentially, they said, no, there's no such thing as a Jewish soul. There's no such thing as a Jewish gene. You're ridiculous. Well, there's such a thing as a priestly gene. There is such a thing as a Jewish priestly gene. So try and tell me there's no such thing as a Jewish gene. I think the jury's out on that one. But it's romantic and comforting and nice to think there is an enduring soul. Yes?
Well, I work for the Lautenberg Center for General and Tumor Immunology in Jerusalem, and we do genetic testing, and they're between Ashkenazi groups and Sephardi groups, and there are more genetic markers that they have in common, that all Jews have in common, as opposed to non-Jews.
There are people who found out that they're Jewish when they came down with Jewish genetic diseases, and that was very traumatic, because first they were finding out they were really sick, and second of all, they were finding out they were really Jewish. Yes. Let's, just 1 second. Yes.
Go ahead.
In light of Senator Lieberman's forefront in the news today, and the revelation of his and his wife's background, you think that many of these people are starting to become reconciled and start to feel comfortable with their Jewishness?
Oh, that's a wonderful... I needed an idea for my next book. Thank you. I don't know. With Senator Lieberman being in the news and not trying to hide and in fact being proud of his Jewish heritage, are these people finding comfort and resolution in that? And can they now come out comfortably and safely and feel better in their own skins, having found out that they're Jewish? What I did find was that America, because it's such an open country, and it has its pros and cons in that respect. You can reinvent yourself. You can move to another town, and nobody's going to know who your parents were, and you can give yourself a new name, and you can give yourself a new religion or ethnicity. On the other hand, because it is so open, there is more acceptance. We hope, there's more tolerance. So time will tell, but it's possible that that will be helpful to them. Yes?
What is a Jewish priestly gene?
Oh,
What is a Jewish priestly gene?
Do you want to answer that question, or?
Well, they did genetic testing on people who are considered Kohanim, who are considered the priestly class. They don't know. Most people know who they are, that they know they're a Kohen, because they have to go up to do certain things in the synagogue that the Kohanim do. And it goes through the father, and each father throughout the generations told their son they were Kohanim. So what they did, they tested all the Kohanim that they can find, a certain percentage, and they found out that they had certain genetic markers in common, a certain gene that all of them had. So they suspect that, yes, they are truly Kohanim from the time of Abraham down.
Does that?
I would like
Okay.
those who don't get tested. I would like to have to.
They tested a large enough sample of, you can look it up in the Times. There was a lot of play about it, and the New York Times, among other places, picked it up. But they tested enough Jewish priests of the priestly caste that it was clear that there was a gene that was specific to them, and very compelling evidence.
They are all from the Levi tribe. There was a tribe, Levi.
They're from the Levites. They're descendants.
Levi
they're all
tribe.
descendants of Levi.
So they are biologically within this frame.
They are
will-
father, son, father, son,
Yes.
father, son. Yes, they are linked.
I had exactly the opposite experience.
I was born in Providence, Rhode Island. We came to New York, the Bronx specifically, when I was barely 3. Living next door to us was this Catholic, I believe they were Catholic family. The last name was Fian. And at the age of 5, I was 5 and the youngest daughter was 9. She took me to a church on Hoe Avenue in the Bronx, and I was indoctrinated. I mean, my mother knew nothing about this, and I was told to look straight ahead at a certain statue, a certain picture, and not to laugh, and not to make any motions, and not to talk, and not to do this. And so I listened to her specifications, and I followed them, and that stuck in my mind. I didn't know I was in a church, and I didn't know I was looking at a replica of Jesus. I had no idea. Later on, I'm the youngest of 4 daughters, and the oldest daughter, she passed away in '86. When we came to New York, she was looking for a job. Now, she had black curly hair, very dark eyes, somewhat, not a swarthy complexion, but very pretty. My father was dark. My mother was so light that she usually passed for a Lutheran or somebody of that nature. Well, not only Caucasian, but Lutheran and definitely not Jewish. And it turned out my mother was the one who followed the Jewish religion, and it's only recently that I went to a, what do they call it when women sit around and Rosh Chodesh. They sit around in a circle and discuss things. And I found out through that why we had never had a Seder, why I had not been indoctrinated into the Jewish religion. And I was told, some woman asked me if my father was a socialist, and I said yes. And she said, is he a Norman Thomas socialist? And I said, yes. How did you know? She said, well, they believe religion is the opiate of the people. You don't need it, and that's why you didn't get it. And then I found out on top of that my father was an atheist. So my mother lit candles Friday night, but nothing else was Jewish. My first Seder,
The truth of the matter is that in the course of my research, I discovered a lot of people who were raised as Jews and then found out that they're non-Jews. And that'll be my 3rd book. Yes.
About 40, 50 years ago, Vincent Sheen wrote a book on personal history. And he said that it wasn't until he was 18, he was brought up in Montana, but it wasn't until he was 18 years old, he went to college, that he met his first Jew. And he said he didn't know anything about Jewish culture or anything. He knew more about the Amish and the Mormons, believe it or not. Maybe he can do some further research on that.
Thank you.
But as a sidelight, I have a clipping about 6 months ago from these personal requests in the newspaper looking for a man or a woman or somebody to meet. And this man wrote a letter. I'm an Italian man. I'm here 7 years. I speak perfect English. I drive a taxi. And I would like to meet a nice Jewish woman. I would like to get married. She must have a car. P.S. Send a picture of the car.
I'll take one last question.
Could you speak a little bit about the people who were brought up Jewish who found out they weren't?
Some of the answer to that gets involved with patrilineal descent. Who is a Jew? Because there was a woman from Miami who wrote to me that she went to get married, and the rabbi interviewed her and said, who was your father, who was your mother? And she said, well, my father was Jewish, my mother was not. And he said, I can't marry you. And she said, why? And he said, you're not really Jewish. And then when her daughter went to get married, the same thing happened to her. She told the family history, and the rabbi said, you're not genuinely Jewish. But another one was the woman I alluded to in terms of adoption. This is a woman who is a very striking, tall, slim, redhead, freckles, Gorgeous. She grew up she knew she was adopted. She was adopted by a short, fat, dark Jewish family. And the Jewish parents, loved classical music. They sent her to Jewish day school. She can't stand chicken soup. She can't stand matzah. She was kicked out of the Jewish day school. She couldn't sit there. It was boring. She didn't look like them. She liked rock and roll. Everything was different. And when she was old enough, she went and did a root search, and she found her mother, and they agreed to meet in a restaurant. And she walks into this restaurant, and there's a tall, slim, gorgeous redhead with freckles. Looked just like her, and she said, I felt like the ugly duckling who had turned into the swan. She said, I finally knew who I was. I finally knew what I was going to look like 20 years hence. My mother likes rock and roll. My mother can't stand chicken soup, my biological mother. And I said to her, so who are you going to marry? You were raised as an Orthodox Jew, and this is going to be very jarring for you. I said, where are you going to look for a husband, among what population? And she said, I think I'm going to have to look. I'm going to look for a Jewish man, I know that. But I'm going to look for somebody tolerant enough to accept me for who I am. I can't live a very rigid Jewish life because it didn't work for me before. It's not going to work for me now. So I have a foot in each world. And those were some of the experiences I came along. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Barbara Kessel. There are copies of Suddenly Jewish to the rear of the event space. We thank you all for joining us this evening, and we invite you now to come up and have your book signed. If you'll kindly come down the center aisle. Thank you, and good evening. You have pens there, Barbara, or would you like our...